Hello, everybody, again. This is Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford with another of my podcasts. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have as a guest the noted historian and classicist Frederick Lauritsen, who wrote recently a piece on his website, which will appear at the end of this piece, on aspects of the relationship between China and Russia, which I thought we might delve further into. So without further ado, welcome, Frederick. Thank you very much for joining us. And let me just plead in advance that I'm not an expert in this field whatsoever. So if any of my questions seem a bit what we would call in Scotland daft laddie questions, I'm sure you'll excuse that and give me the layman's answer.
Well, thank you, Stuart, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to discuss an interesting topic. I look forward to our conversation.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Well, basically, I think the essence of the piece that you wrote was contained in the quotation that Russia is a colony of China, which is fighting a proxy war with the West. And that's what caught my attention initially. But I wonder, could I start off with some fairly sort of basic background questions? And one of the topics that always comes up, and I'm referring to my notes here to show how basic my knowledge is, that people are constantly referring to China's Road and Belt Initiative. Now, I think I understand what that means, but could you elucidate on that and sort of, for the layman, just say what it actually means?
Yes, so I think we have to consider it from the perspective of Western Europe and of Europe generally, that China effectively is looking for a means of communication and mainly transport of the goods that it produces towards the West. Now, the thing is that naturally this is obviously an official policy of the Chinese government and Chinese state, but the main thing is that it has two main ways it can achieve this contact with the West. Let's say if it wants to transport, let's say, for example, a series of telephones to Germany, it can either do it through Central Asia, so a number of countries. So that would mean the road and belt that's for that reason following the old Silk route effectively. Or it can go further north through the Russian Federation. From a Chinese perspective, the Russian Federation would actually be the much better option, because it would mean that they would have one customs check between China and Russia, and then another one effectively between Belarus and Poland. That means that they're not really crossing that many borders. The route which goes further south is crossing a series of countries which have now become extremely important, like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. There's a whole series of countries that would need very robust diplomatic agreements to make sure that there's no disruption in that route. So from a Chinese perspective, the Trans-Siberian is the ideal route. They don't have access to it in the way they would like. And in the West, effectively, Russia has a closed border with Western Europe because of the events in Ukraine. So the Chinese are probably feeling rather isolated, ironically. They don't have a way of communicating by land to a very good consumer market, which is that of the European Union, of the UK, and Scandinavia generally.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That makes it much clearer to me. Now, in your article, you say, and this probably leads on from what we've just been talking about, that Russia has become a colony of Chinese interests. Can you expand on that again?
Well, what happened is that the Russians effectively have renounced an island which is in between two rivers, the river Usursky and the Ussuri, and the river Amur. Now, the River Amur is extremely symbolic for the Russians. It's a bit like referring to the far west in the United States. The Amur is a river that's very well known to the standard Russian population. It's the great push towards the east. And there are funny things like there's the Amur tiger. They have a festival in Vladivostok of the tiger that's there, that's a symbol of the area. But the Chinese have always claimed all that area as being Chinese. They lost it around 1860 in the great Russian drive to really settle those areas. They weren't just discovered, then they were settled, and the Trans-Siberian route becomes very important, the route to the east. And there are Russians living there, bizarrely enough, Cossacks of all strange things in Kharabovsk city. So this is an area that for the Russians is very Russian, but before 1860, it was part of the larger Chinese world. So the Chinese are happy to reclaim those areas, which for them historically probably shouldn't be Russian. They haven't pushed the case, but they're slowly, kilometer by kilometer, they're regaining these lands. With this specific concession, one has to think that the Chinese are driving a bit of a wedge, effectively, between Vladivostok and the rest of Russia. They're slowly moving northwards. And for them,
annexation by stealth. I mean, it's it almost shades of the debate about Ukraine, about Crimea, about who was there first and who does it belong to, and should Khrushchev have given Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 and all that stuff.
There was President Putin of the Russian Federation went to Beijing the other day for the 10th anniversary of the Rotenbelt Initiative. That signals that the Russians are very interested in being the principal partner of the Chinese to transport goods from China west. They want to be the main corridor. They signed a series of agreements around the 17th, 18th, 19th of October. One of them struck me in particular because it was a concession of 32 million hectares of land for the production of crops that would be sold to the Chinese. Effectively, it's, I think, what used to be called in the 80s a joint venture. So they looks like very much a government agencies who've come up with an agreement. So it's like state corporations, the Chengtong in China, and an equivalent that's been set up in Russia. The Chengtong holding group is extremely powerful and very large. The equivalent in Russia seems mainly like the recipient of a joint venture partnership. But effectively, what is being grown in these 32 million hectares goes only to China, which means that, let's say there's an increase in value of these grains and the Russians suddenly want to sell it somewhere else. They can't. So it's a 12-year project at the moment, but probably with options to extend the duration.
Okay, so it's a sort of exclusive arrangement, really, as far as
it's an exclusive
China is
arrangement.
concerned, anyway.
And the problem there is that it's in the far east of Russia, which means it's very, very far from Moscow.
Yes.
And the population is very sparse. There's no one living there. So effectively, the Chinese have taken over economically the most valuable area of the far east of Russia.
And which you said is the size of Germany, or
yes, exactly. It's slightly smaller. The agricultural land they've considered is smaller than Germany and slightly bigger than Poland, and it's exact equivalent of all the cultivatable land in Ukraine,
which of course has been Ukraine's great economic strength.
Exactly. So the thing is that this may be reading too much into it, but sometimes it's useful to read too much into things. And if Russia had been successful in its plan to take over Ukraine and at least make it a country that was more or less dependent on Moscow, they would have not felt the loss of 32 million hectares in the Far East, because it's exactly the same amount of land in Ukraine. The Russians now find themselves without the 32 million hectares of Ukraine, but without the ones in the Far East either.
So hoist by their own petard in many
Well,
ways.
yes, but the Chinese are probably rather pleased about this situation.
I'll bet. I'll bet.
I think this is absolutely huge. This is a very, very big thing for the Russians and the Chinese, actually. So it's at a scale that I think I'm actually surprised it hasn't been more of a headline. It's a very big event. The thing is that reading the speeches and the agreements, because I looked through some of them, the ones that are publicly available, what is clear is that it looks like the Chinese are very simply going to build their own infrastructure on Russian territory. They're doing what they're doing in Africa. So it's not really a joint venture at all. And one of the agricultural magazines in Russia actually pointed out in the last line, it said, this is going to bring no benefit to Russian farmers. So it's very clear how it's set up. It's Chinese infrastructure within the Russian Federation with exclusive benefit to the Chinese. So it's a scheme that's been seen before. So it's not like a joint venture from the mid 80s. It's a completely different scheme, and it looks like a form of colonization.
What does Russia get out of this deal, really? And also, how do you see the next 12 years, as you said, the deal will last? How do you see that panning out?
Yes, well, Russia, I think, is now considering that China is the only option it has in order to have access to the rest of the world. It needs China as an ally, and it needs Chinese support in order to continue as a viable country. There's also in the background, there's the lingering fear that local tensions might create conflict within the Russian Federation. So they probably think that the Chinese are against that, and they want to keep the Russian Federation intact to have this direct access to the West we mentioned. So the contract is rather short, it's 12 years, but I think is not because of a Russian desire, but because of a Chinese one to reconsider where they will be in 10, 12, 15 years' time. Honestly, I wouldn't think that the Chinese and the Russians are apt to go to war with each other. The Chinese, I think, ironically, will always prefer diplomacy to conflict. It's one of those strange Chinese traditions. They just, a bit like the Indians, they like the idea of solving problems rather than moving them to a higher level. So I don't think they're looking for conflict with Russia. The only thing that could generate a conflict is if there were internal strife in the Russian Federation. And the only way to avoid that is with a regime change. They need to change who's at the top in Moscow.
That's absolutely fascinating, if I may say so. Do stay tuned for part two, which will be the conclusion of this fascinating interview with Frederick Lauritsen.